Have you ever wondered why so many of us cling to traditions that have no roots in the Quran, yet hesitate to live by what Allah has clearly revealed? We wear the name Muslim with pride, but when the culture speaks louder than the Quran, something sacred within us begins to die, slowly, quietly, and almost unnoticed. We live in a time where culture often defines faith more than the Quran does. From how we dress, to how we marry, to how we raise our children, so much of what we call Islam has been wrapped and redefined through cultural expectations. We grow up learning that pleasing people is more important than pleasing Allah. We fear the judgment of our relatives more than the judgment of our Lord. And somewhere between family expectations and societal norms, the voice of the Quran becomes faint. When a woman chooses to wear hijab, she is told, what will people say? When a man chooses to pray regularly, he's mocked as too religious. When we want to follow the sunnah, we are told, that's not our way. But what if our way no longer aligns with Allah's way? What if our traditions, though wrapped in nostalgia, have become chains that distance us from divine truth? The problem isn't that culture exists. The problem is when culture becomes the standard of truth instead of the Quran. The Quran was meant to liberate us from blind imitation, yet we've built walls around it with practices that were never meant to define our Deen. We confuse identity with revelation, emotion with guidance, and approval with righteousness. And in doing so, we lose touch with the very purpose of Islam, to submit to Allah alone, not to a society's definition of what is acceptable or respectable. There is a deep psychological reason why culture feels safer than revelation. The Quran demands transformation, culture demands conformity. The Quran asks us to challenge our egos, our comfort zones, and even the systems around us when they contradict truth. Culture, however, tells us to fit in, to maintain appearances, to avoid conflict. It whispers, don't stand out, don't be strange. But Islam began with strangers, men and women who dared to put revelation before reputation. They were mocked, boycotted, and even exiled, yet they chose the Quran over comfort. Today, we often choose the opposite. We silence our conscience when the truth feels inconvenient. When practicing faith costs us social approval, we might memorize verses, yet ignore their meaning in practice. We decorate our homes with Quranic calligraphy while forgetting the message those words carry. Our hearts crave peace. We look for it in cultural rituals instead of divine remembrance. The irony is that the Quran was sent to heal the diseases of the heart, yet we have replaced it with customs that often deepen them: pride, comparison, and hypocrisy. When we begin to live through the lens of culture, we are no longer guided by divine truth, but by collective opinion. And collective opinion can be louder than revelation if the heart is not rooted in sincerity. This isn't to say that all culture is wrong. Islam embraces diversity. It allows space for beauty in language, dress, and tradition, as long as these do not contradict the commands of Allah. The problem arises when we start prioritizing what pleases people over what pleases the Creator. When weddings become about showing wealth instead of honoring a sacred bond. When funerals become displays of status instead of reminders of accountability. When our youth are told that following the Quran too closely will make them backward, these are not just cultural shifts, they are spiritual red flags. Because every time we justify disobedience in the name of tradition, we drift further from the very source of peace we are searching for. The Quran was sent as a mercy, a manual for life, a guide for hearts lost in confusion. But if we only treat it as a symbol of identity and not a source of direction, it will remain a book we revere on shelves but fail to live within our souls. Real faith begins when we choose the Quran over convenience, when we choose principle over popularity, and when we let revelation redefine what success and happiness truly mean. To return to the Quran is to return to ourselves. It is to peel away the layers of societal conditioning that have numbed our spiritual senses. It is to question, not to rebel, but to seek truth with humility. When we open the Quran, we are not just reading a book, we are being read by it. Its verses reveal what our culture hides. It shows us how to treat people with justice, how to purify our hearts, how to live with purpose. And the moment we start to live by it, life begins to make sense again. The anxiety that comes from trying to please everyone fades because now we are focused on pleasing the one who never changes his standards. The emptiness that culture cannot fill begins to dissolve, replaced by a peace that no social approval can match. The Prophet A said, "I have left you with two things. If you hold on to them, you will never go astray. The Book of Allah and my Sunnah." This is not a call to abandon culture. It is a call to realign it. Let culture serve faith, not replace it. Let it beautify our lives, not dictate our beliefs. because in the end, every custom, every trend, every societal standard will fade, but the words of Allah will remain eternal, guiding those who seek light in an age of imitation. Have you ever noticed how deeply many of us have allowed our culture to shape our faith, until the line between what is Islamic and what is merely traditional becomes almost invisible? We grow up surrounded by customs that our families call religion, yet when we look closer, we find that much of it has little or nothing to do with the Quran. From the way we celebrate weddings to how we raise our children, from how we judge people's worth to how we treat women and men, so many of these ideas come not from divine revelation, but from inherited patterns of behavior that were passed down generation after generation. The danger lies in how easily these practices can overshadow the Quran's guidance. We become comfortable in the familiarity of culture. It makes us feel safe, accepted, and connected to our community. But comfort is not the same as truth. The Quran does not ask us to conform to what society approves. It asks us to surrender to what Allah commands. Yet, surrendering can feel threatening when it requires us to question the very traditions we grew up believing were sacred. Culture often glorifies the opinions of elders, the pressure of what people will say, and the fear of social judgment. So instead of asking, "What does Allah want from me?" we ask, "What will they think of me?" That is where the heart begins to drift away from revelation. Many of us perform rituals, celebrate occasions, and uphold customs simply because it's always been done this way. But when we examine them under the light of the Quran, we might realize that some of these acts actually contradict the very essence of Islam: humility, sincerity, justice, and the remembrance of Allah. The Quran came to free us from blind imitation, yet we have imprisoned ourselves in the opinions of others. We confuse our culture's approval with divine acceptance, and our identity becomes tied to human expectations rather than to the Creator's guidance. This leads to a spiritual numbness, where we practice Islam outwardly but feel an emptiness inwardly because our actions no longer connect us to the purpose of worship. They only connect us to the need to belong. True faith demands courage, the courage to question cultural habits, to unlearn what is wrong, and to stand firm on truth even when it isolates us. The Quran was revealed not to erase culture, but to refine it, to filter out what leads to pride, oppression, or disobedience, and to preserve what aligns with righteousness and beauty. Yet, many of us have inverted this purpose. We filter out the Quran instead, accepting only the parts that fit comfortably within our lifestyle. We quote verses selectively, interpret them through cultural bias, and silence voices that call us back to sincerity. The tragedy is that in protecting our customs, we often harm our souls. When culture becomes our religion, we begin to worship social norms instead of Allah's commands. We place honor, status, and family reputation above the moral values of compassion, honesty, and equality that the Quran teaches. We pressure our daughters to marry for wealth instead of faith, and our sons to seek prestige instead of piety. We make religion harder than it was ever meant to be, layering it with unnecessary rules and shame that Allah never prescribed. This distance from revelation not only weakens our spiritual connection, but also fragments our unity as an ummah. Because when everyone follows their own cultural version of Islam, truth becomes relative and the message of the Quran becomes diluted. The only way back is through honest reflection, returning to the Quran not as a book of rituals, but as a living guide. It calls us to think, to feel, to awaken. When we truly read it, we realize how much of our life we have spent trying to please people who can neither benefit nor harm us. We begin to understand that true peace does not come from fitting in, but from aligning with truth. The Quran does not demand perfection. It invites transformation. And transformation always begins with awareness. When we recognize that cultural loyalty has sometimes replaced spiritual sincerity, we can finally start to rebuild our faith from its foundation. That foundation is not nationality, family, expectation, heritage. It is submission to the Creator who knows what purifies the heart and what corrupts it. So, the next time we face a choice between what culture expects and what the Quran commands, we must ask ourselves, whose approval am I truly seeking? Because the one who chooses revelation over reputation may lose acceptance in this world, but gains peace in the next. And the one who chooses culture over truth may gain applause today, but risks losing the very light that was meant to guide them home. In the end, culture fades, trends change, and generations move on, but the words of Allah remain eternal, calling us back to a higher way of living, one that liberates the soul from imitation and anchors it in divine wisdom. We live in a time where culture has become louder than revelation, Where the voice of society often drowns out the voice of the Quran, many Muslims today inherit their understanding of Islam not from the Book of Allah, but from the habits of their families, the customs of their nations, and the opinions of their communities. We grow up hearing, "This is how it's done," rather than "This is what Allah commands." The problem is not culture itself. Islam never came to erase culture. It came to guide it, refine it, and remove from it what is unjust or misguided. But somewhere along the way, we confused guidance with imitation and religion with tradition. When cultural practices take precedence over divine revelation, faith becomes hollow, a shell of rituals performed without spiritual depth. We begin to follow Islam not out of conviction, but out of habit. We judge others not by the sincerity of their hearts, but by how closely they conform to our cultural image of piety. A woman who wears modest clothes but not a cultural style is criticized. A man who chooses simplicity over show is ridiculed. Weddings become competitions of extravagance rather than celebrations of a sacred bond. Funeral rites turn into displays of wealth rather than reflections on mortality. In these moments, we forget that Allah never tied faith to the standards of people. He tied it to the purity of the heart. The Quran reminds us repeatedly that honor comes from righteousness, not from lineage, appearance, or social approval. Yet how many of us live by this truth? We fear being judged by our relatives more than being judged by our Creator. We cling to customs even when we know they contradict revelation, simply because we fear standing out. The irony is that we are meant to be a people of light, leaders who question falsehood and stand firm on truth. When culture becomes our compass, we end up following instead of leading, reacting instead of reflecting. We lose our ability to see Islam as a living, breathing guidance and begin to treat it as a heritage artifact, a symbol to display, not a principle to live by. And slowly, without realizing it, our relationship with Allah becomes filtered through the lens of cultural expectations rather than sincere submission. The tragedy of prioritizing culture over the Quran is that it empties faith of its transformative power. The Quran was sent to awaken hearts, to liberate minds from the chains of ignorance and blind following. But when we replace revelation with inherited patterns, we build walls around our spirituality. We start believing that this is just how things are, and so we stop asking questions. Yet Allah repeatedly calls upon us to think, to reflect, to use our intellect. He warns us not to follow the ways of our forefathers blindly when those ways contradict divine truth. Still, how often do we hear people say, "This is how our parents did it," as if that alone justifies everything? True Islam asks for something deeper. It asks for sincerity, for courage, for truthfulness. It asks us to confront uncomfortable realities, to recognize when culture has disguised itself as religion, and to choose revelation even when it isolates us. This requires humility, to admit that our elders, our society, or even we ourselves may have misunderstood. It requires letting go of pride, of ego, of the desire to please people at the expense of pleasing Allah. When Muslims begin to return to the Quran with open hearts, free from cultural filters, a transformation occurs. The Quran speaks directly to the soul, reminding it that Islam was never meant to conform to any culture. It was meant to elevate all cultures. When faith is purified from cultural distortion, worship becomes sincere, relationships become just, and society becomes balanced. We stop asking, "What will people say?" and begin to ask, "What does Allah say?" That shift alone changes everything. It brings peace where there was anxiety, clarity where there was confusion, and purpose where there was emptiness. So, the question every believer must ask is simple but profound. Do I practice Islam as a social identity or as a spiritual commitment to Allah? The one who lives by culture will constantly change with trends. The one who lives by revelation will find stability no matter how chaotic the world becomes. True honor is not in preserving customs, but in preserving truth. And the one who stands by truth even when alone stands with Allah, and that is the greatest victory of all. In today's world, many Muslims have unconsciously allowed culture to become the lens through which they see Islam rather than the other way around. What was meant to be a religion that liberates the soul and guides humanity toward truth has, for many, become mixed with inherited customs, national traditions, and community expectations that often overshadow divine revelation. The real danger lies in how subtle this shift is, how easily one can confuse cultural values for religious obligations. People begin to believe that certain acts are Islamic simply because their society practices them, and that others are un-Islamic because they deviate from their culture, even when the Quran and Sunnah say otherwise. A simple example can be seen in the way marriage, family honor, or gender roles are treated. Many communities have traditions that oppress women in the name of modesty or shame men for expressing vulnerability in the name of strength. These are not divine principles, they are human inventions. When we let these man-made standards define what it means to be a good Muslim, we lose sight of the heart of Islam's sincerity, justice, mercy, and devotion to Allah alone. This confusion often leads to guilt, division, and hypocrisy. People start practicing faith to meet social approval rather than to please their creator. And slowly, Islam becomes a set of performances, a collection of appearances and expectations that are judged through cultural eyes. The Prophet came to free people from such chains, to break the hold of false traditions that led to arrogance, oppression, and blind imitation. Yet even now, so many Muslims find themselves repeating the same mistake, believing that following cultural norms is the same as following faith. This creates generations of believers who love Islam but experience it as a burden rather than a source of peace, because it has been buried beneath cultural weight. When a person begins to question this confusion and truly returns to the Quran, something profound happens. Their entire perspective shifts. They realize that Islam was never meant to erase identity or culture. It was meant to refine them. Allah did not create one Muslim culture, but rather, He revealed a universal message meant to fit every culture so long as it stays within the bounds of what is halal and avoids what is haram. Islam celebrates diversity, as long as that diversity honors truth. But when culture dictates values instead of being guided by revelation, it becomes an idol in the heart. That idol can be family pride, ethnic superiority, gender bias, or social image, all of which the Quran came to destroy. The person who follows revelation must learn to be brave enough to go against the tide. When culture contradicts Islam, this is never easy. It may mean being misunderstood, criticized, or isolated, yet the Quran reminds us that standing for truth often requires standing alone. The believer who fears Allah more than people finds peace even in loneliness, while the one who fears people more than Allah loses peace even in the crowd. When Muslims begin to prioritize divine guidance over inherited customs, their faith becomes alive again. They start seeing Islam as a path to inner freedom, not a set of imposed rules. They begin to feel closer to Allah because they are finally worshiping Him sincerely, not through the expectations of others, but through personal conviction and love. This revival is what the Ummah desperately needs: Muslims who think deeply, question respectfully, and follow truth courageously. It is not rebellion against culture, it is alignment with revelation. And from that alignment comes both peace and strength. Ultimately, the struggle between culture and Quran is a struggle between conformity and authenticity. Every believer must decide which master they serve, the approval of people or the pleasure of Allah. The one who chases social validation will always feel anxious because people's standards change like the wind. But the one who submits to Allah's truth finds stability in every storm. It is only when we stop using culture as a shield that we can truly see the beauty and depth of Islam. The Quran teaches balance, mercy, and justice. It does not confine, it liberates. But liberation requires courage. It means breaking patterns that have existed for generations, confronting bias, and replacing imitation with understanding. It means realizing that love for our culture should never outweigh love for our Creator. Islam was revealed to unite hearts upon truth, not to divide them through pride or ignorance. So the next time you feel torn between what people expect and what Allah commands, remember this: the world's approval fades, but Allah's pleasure endures. Choosing revelation over culture is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of faith. It is the moment when the believer stops performing Islam for others and begins to live it for Allah. And that moment, when truth replaces tradition in the heart, is when real transformation begins. Many Muslims today live in a world where culture has subtly taken the place of divine guidance, where societal expectations shape faith more than the words of Allah. It begins innocently. People cling to the ways of their parents and grandparents, assuming that whatever has been practiced for generations must be correct. But over time, culture begins to dominate and the Quran becomes secondary. When this happens, Islam is no longer experienced as a spiritual journey, but as a social identity. The problem is not that culture exists. Islam never came to erase culture, but that people begin to treat their traditions as sacred even when they contradict revelation. Some equate modesty with silence, others confuse honor with control, and some measure faith by outward rituals while ignoring the heart's sincerity. The deeper tragedy is that this confusion leads many to judge others unfairly, believing that following their culture equals following Islam. Yet the Quran repeatedly warns against blind imitation and calls people to reflect, to think, and to use reason in the light of revelation. When a society forgets this, it risks replacing divine justice with cultural pride, mercy with judgment, and balance with extremism. Slowly, the spiritual essence of Islam fades, replaced by rigid expectations and emotional exhaustion because people are trying to please the world instead of their creator. When a believer decides to step back and measure everything by the Quran, something profound happens. They begin to realize how Islam is not meant to burden but to liberate. It does not seek to destroy traditions but to purify them from corruption. It allows diversity of culture, language, and custom, but always within the boundaries of divine principles. For example, one culture may express joy through song, another through poetry, another through hospitality. All are acceptable so long as they do not contradict what Allah has made lawful. The problem begins when people elevate their way of life above revelation, when they begin to label others as less religious simply for practicing Islam differently from their cultural norm. This false sense of superiority creates division and arrogance. The Prophet came to unite humanity upon truth, not upon tribe or ethnicity. True faith means surrendering to Allah's wisdom, even when it challenges what we have been taught by society. It requires humility to admit that not everything passed down to us is pure, and it requires courage to act on revelation even when it means going against family expectations or societal trends. The one who does this begins to taste the sweetness of true submission because their loyalty is no longer to people, but to the truth itself. However, this path is not easy. A believer who prioritizes the Quran over culture will often face criticism, isolation, or misunderstanding. People may call them rebellious or accuse them of abandoning their roots, but in truth, they are not leaving their culture. They are returning it to its rightful place. They are aligning it with divine truth. Every prophet faced a similar struggle, challenging the unjust traditions of their people not to destroy them, but to restore balance. The Quran tells us that those who stand for truth must be ready to stand alone, because society often resists change. Yet Allah promises that He is always near those who are sincere. Every sacrifice made for His sake, every moment of pain or alienation becomes a means of purification. The believer learns to find peace in pleasing Allah even when the world disapproves. And over time, others begin to see the light in that courage, the calmness in that surrender. It is through such individuals that communities transform, because truth spreads through example, not through argument. The one who lives the Quran, who shows kindness and balance, becomes a living reminder that Islam's beauty lies not in rigid imitation, but in conscious devotion. In the end, the struggle between culture and revelation is the struggle between appearance and authenticity. Each believer must ask, am I practicing Islam because it is true, or because it is familiar? The answer determines the state of one's heart. The one who seeks truth with sincerity will find that Islam, in its purest form, transcends every culture. It speaks to the soul, not just to the surface. The Quran gives timeless guidance, while culture changes with every generation. When Muslims learn to use revelation as their compass, culture becomes a reflection of beauty, not a source of confusion. The goal is not to erase identity, but to anchor it in faith. A heart that chooses Allah over people gains clarity, confidence, and peace because it no longer needs the world's approval. Islam was never meant to imprison the human spirit under the weight of customs. It was meant to set it free through submission to truth. So, when you stand at the crossroads between what is popular and what is right, between what pleases people and what pleases Allah, remember that peace will never come from conformity. It comes only from sincerity. And the moment you choose revelation over reputation, you begin to experience the Islam that liberates, heals, and elevates the soul beyond every cultural boundary.